Good afternoon and welcome to Close Reading 3.0, supporting English learners in reading complex text before, during, and after reading. This is part one of a three-part series. Today we're going to build a little background and focus primarily on how to prepare for reading or the before reading part. This webinar is presented by the California Reading and Literacy Project, Fresno Region, and it is led by me, Jean Kofelt-Berletic. And I am a CRLP teacher leader and a fifth grade teacher. I have a passion for literacy, language, teaching, and learning. I've been a teacher for 21 years, and I've been working with CRLP for 20 of those years. So it's close to my heart, and I have a long history with CRLP. So I'm happy to share a little bit with you today about what we do. Our agenda this afternoon is short. We will begin with familiarizing ourselves with scaffolding as it is explained in the California ELA-ELD framework. Then we will carry on and develop a deeper understanding of close reading. I know that's probably a familiar term to most of us. It's been around for many years now with the Common Core standards, but we're going to look at it through the lens of content instruction. Then we will examine the elements of text and task analysis. And finally, explore considerations for preparing students to read complex texts. Beginning with scaffolding. And we're beginning with scaffolding because when we're talking about supports for English learners, the framework calls those scaffolds, and I'm sure that's not a new term to most of us either. But through the lens of the ELA-ELD framework, it looks like this. They define scaffolding or explain that scaffolding does not change the intellectual challenge of the text, but instead allows learners to successfully participate in or complete the task in order to build the knowledge and skills to be able to perform similar tasks independently in the future. That meaning it's a means to an end, and the scaffolding starts with the students and slowly and little by little it comes away. It's a metaphorical term, and it really refers to particular ways that teachers provide that temporary support to students, and they adjust to their particular learning zones. It draws on the notion from Vygotsky back in the 70s of the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, that most of us probably learned about back in college. And it defines the instructional space that exists between what a learner can currently do independently and that which is too difficult for them and becomes frustrating without strategic support or scaffolding. And the scaffolding is that temporary help that is oriented toward the future. It doesn't occur spontaneously, and so the framework also describes two types of scaffolding. The first one being planned scaffolding, what teachers prepare and do in advance of teaching in order to promote access to academic and linguistic development. And this preparation that teachers do ahead of time, or the heavy lifting, really makes for ease of a lesson during teaching. And it's based on the student or the lesson goals, as well as the student's needs. So the identified learner needs and the task that we anticipate, the challenges that it might put out to students. So it has a dual goal of engaging students intellectually with challenging instructional activities, while also providing them with appropriate supports. So that planned scaffolding that teachers do ahead of lessons enables them to also apply or implement just-in-time scaffolding that happens during instruction. So this happens flexibly, and it attends to the student's needs when a teacher is checking for understanding along the way during a lesson. This type of scaffolding is in the moment formative assessment driven, And it happens by a teacher closely observing students' responses to the instruction and then providing support as needed. Now, some of those just-in-time scaffolds can also be pre-planned, like you have it in your pocket just in case that occurs. And they take into account what students already know and their language support that might be needed. Some examples of these types of scaffolds. Some of the planned ones that teachers put into place would be connecting to or building from building students' prior knowledge or background, sequencing tasks from something that's more accessible to something that's more challenging. For example, modeling, explaining, and guided practice, so the lesson design following that sequence. Frequently checking students' understanding during a lesson and at the end of a lesson. Having students work collaboratively, providing students with visual information like anchor charts or graphic organizers or thinking maps, and providing language models, both oral and written, of what the expectation is or the vehicle that they would use to explain their thinking. 1 second, please. I'm trying to answer you, Mary Lou. Hold on one moment. I'll get right back to you. And some examples of some just-in-time scaffolding would be you reply to a student based on, you give them another prompt for elaboration or so that you can get a clarification of what they understand. And that would be, did I understand you to say, or did you mean, or could you please restate that? This also includes targeted paraphrasing and another opportunity for a teacher to model the correct response or the correct form of a response and adjusting based on those frequent checks of understanding. Additionally, you could preview and make connections to prior knowledge. And this meaning as you're reading, you can, because before the reading you would assess their prior knowledge, you could refer back to that and say, remember before we started reading and we talked about these things and how they were connected? And so you make connections back to that so it sticks. Those are some examples of just-in-time scaffolding. And Mary Lou was asking if this was being recorded, and it is. A little more on scaffolding examples. The framework also defines more specifically types of scaffolds that are appropriate for English learners. And this is a notion of students at different levels of English proficiency, from emerging to expanding to bridging, needing different types of support and different levels of support. So moving from substantial to moderate to light, depending upon their linguistic capabilities. It also takes, there's another aspect of it, which we'll get into soon, which is the type of text that they're working with and their familiarity with that, or the type of task they will have to do to demonstrate their learning. So with that in mind, I'm sure I don't have to make a case for close reading anymore, but it is the thoughtful, critical reading and analysis of the text. And the students who meet the standards with close reading or with reading complex text readily undertake the close attentive reading that is at the heart of understanding and enjoying complex works of literature, meaning that if students can read closely, they can attentively read and understand and even enjoy many different types of reading. And we would all hope that our students would get to that place. Specifically from the standards, we can think about close reading in terms of the three different groups of standards, with key ideas and details being one aspect, where we would say, what does the text say and what does it mean? So these would be a little bit more straightforward questions, not necessarily just right there questions, but students should be able to determine what the text says explicitly, as well as being able to understand some of the implicit meanings or to be able to make inferences from that. They will also be able to summarize them, general ideas and themes, how ideas and characters develop and interact, and again, making the logical inferences, as well as connecting that to the citing textual evidence to support their conclusions. So they need to be able to read it and understand it, and also explain their thinking, connecting back to the text itself. And it's a lofty goal, but the kids are doing it, especially with good scaffolds in place. The next section of our standards is craft and structure. So how did the text say it? And students should be able to interpret the meanings of words and phrases and the structure of text to determine how they affect the meaning or tone, and how points of view and purpose shape content and style. So why did the author write it this way? As well as understanding words in context and different types of vocabulary and how they change the piece of text. Integration of knowledge and ideas is the third set. And this is really answering the questions: what is the text's deeper meaning? What is its value? How does the text connect to the reader and other texts? And students should be able to synthesize and compare information from print and digital sources, and also critically evaluate the reasoning and rhetoric of a text and its relationship to their own world and other experiences and other texts. So that's how close reading is seen or displayed in the standards. And students, with close reading, students will not only be just reading the text, but also asking and answering questions, citing textual evidence. They're analyzing, investigating, probing, considering, questioning, identifying, creating, using what they learn from the text to create new learning and make those connections to what they already know as well. And this type of reading, it enhances lectures, but it enhances all other learning experiences as well. And the framework supports using it frequently and consistently, that this tool of close reading is a tool for life, and it should be applied in broad and diverse ways. So lots of different types of texts and lots of different opportunities to apply it. With that in mind, how do we plan for close reading? It's all through our standards, and we know that the ELA standards are everybody's standards, no matter what content area they teach, as well as the ELD standards. And close reading is throughout the whole thing. It is a tool for them to learn, as well as a way for them to demonstrate their understanding. So how do we select the right text for this work? One consideration is, like I just said, the standards or the framework actually explains that the more you know, the more you know. So the more times you apply it in the different contexts, the better you get at it and the more you get out of your experience. So text reinforces lecture content and demonstrations. It also enables students to negotiate. They need to be able to negotiate difficult text, and it enables them to look back on their experiences and clarify for them maybe some questions they had if they were, say, in a science class and they weren't quite sure, they didn't have quite the word for what they saw in a phenomenon, they may read a piece of text and it could provide that. Oh, that's right, that's what I thought, and here it is in this text. And the reading of academic content area text reinforces academic vocabulary use as well as comprehension. And briefly, this is kind of the intersection, the center part, where in the practices in science, math, and English language arts really focus on students being able to read, write, and speak in ways that are grounded in evidence, and focus on a strong base knowledge that is built through content-rich texts. And of course, then engaging in argument from evidence as well, and that is another aspect. So when planning for close reading, their students are not going to closely read every single thing that they have to read, but when you do, it should be high quality text that's worth reading and rereading. Because typically when close reading, students are reading a minimum of 3 times. Usually the first time slowly, then going back and reading it again for a different purpose, whether it's answering a specific question or finding a specific feature. Really important, the second bullet here, the teacher must read the text. And I know that sounds silly, but it is oftentimes teachers put in front of students text that they haven't even completely read. And it's really difficult to understand the pitfalls that your students may have with it, or the benefits that your students may get from reading the text if you haven't read it yourself. So teacher reading closely is key. And in this, you must analyze the text and figure out what might be difficult, the structure, the content, what you're asking students to do with it, so that you can carefully plan the instructions so students focus strategically on interpreting those implicit and explicit meanings that they could find in the text. And I'm sure this is another graphic that's familiar to you. This is key to understanding text and task complexity. So what makes a text complex? And there are 3 dimensions, the qualitative dimensions of text complexity. Well, actually, I'll start with the quantitative one, number 2. Those are the ones such as word length and frequency and sentence lengths and text cohesion and how familiar it is, how familiar the language structure is. Really long texts usually have a higher difficulty level. This can be figured out by a computer. So you can feed in a piece of text and it can give you a quantitative analysis of how complex the text is. The other 2 components, qualitative and reader and task considerations, are both parts that people have to do. And most importantly, the teacher needs to do. The qualitative dimensions of text complexity include aspects that are related to the purpose, the structure, the language conventionality. Have we used that word before? Have my students ever looked at a piece of text that's laid out like this? How clear are the ideas? And how sophisticated is the language or unfamiliar is the language? And that is related to the qualitative aspect. And that also has a piece of who your students are and what their text experiences are. So it really is the human aspect. The third component is related to the reader and the task. So what are we asking students to do with the text, or the information that they get from the text? Who are these students and what motivates them? What knowledge can I connect to from what we've done earlier in this year, or what I know they did a few years ago? And what am I going to ask them to do with the information? So I'm reading this so that I'm having them read this so that they can compare and contrast, or that they can explain for whatever that different reason is. So text can change based on the task that students are being asked to do and how complex they are. With that in mind, the work of preparing to read So once you've selected a text that you think will be powerful for your students, you know that it's challenging and rigorous, and it's most likely not one that they would get through on their own. We can think about how we will take our students through it. So this is where we're going to get into the before reading section. Next week, we're going to talk about how to support students with close reading during reading. But today we're going to think a little bit about how do I prepare my students for reading without giving away the entire text. So this is the work before the work. Very important to keep in mind is begin with the end in mind. And this notion is not new in education, but it's highly accurate, effective way to think about pretty much everything we do. So we really have to think about how is this connected to my students, and where am I taking them with this? Why are we choosing this book, and where do I need to get to with this piece of text? And students are often unaware of the connections that they have, that there are between the different pieces of knowledge that they have, what they read, and what their experiences are in life. So some of these beginning reading instruction activities or routines actually help students connect to that. And it's not new. Accessing prior knowledge for students and sometimes developing that is not a new notion, but it's definitely an effective one, because students are not necessarily conscious of those connections unless you stop and, for instance, have them think pair share or do a think write pair share. And because the disciplinary texts differ so much in terms of information and how they're laid out and how language is used, sometimes we have to explicitly instruct in how do you make meaning in a text like this. So some of the examples here we have are a background overview. So this happens before you read. Activate and assess students' background knowledge. So find out what they know, and it'll enable you to know how much support and scaffolding you need through it and what types. And sometimes we have to develop background knowledge for students as well. This also lets them connect, and it broadens the field. You could do this with videos or different images, graphic organizers, or sometimes a more accessible text on the same topic that would give them some background knowledge. I can give you an example. In my ELD class, or in my language class, we've been reading some texts about volcanoes lately, and the text that we were reading was probably 2 grade levels above where most of my students were working. So we read some more accessible texts first so that they could talk about, terminology related to volcanoes, so that they then could read another text and explain causes and effects of volcanoes and plate tectonics and things like that. And that also gives us a place to provide context. So we have a place to connect to what they know and tell them where they're headed. So it doesn't seem like a random thing. And the second part of before reading is setting a purpose for reading. And this is important, especially for English learners, because you want to narrow their focus. Sometimes the text itself can be so daunting, long, full of words they don't know. But when you explain what the purpose is for the reading, read to find out what causes earthquakes. It takes down the pressure of thinking that they have to understand the entire piece of text, and it lets them get a laser-like focus on that information. Then you can build from there. And so that would be explaining the receptive task. Why are you reading this? What are you reading for? And then another thing you would do before you're reading is explain the expressive task, or why are you reading this? What are you going to do with this information? So you're going to read about volcanoes, for instance, and when you're done, you're going to talk to a partner about 3 different types of volcanoes that you read about today and be able to describe them. so they know what their task is with reading and what their task will be after. It really helps them get to the information they need. And then finally, previewing the text for text structures and text features. So to be able to point out to students how the text is laid out and what types of text structures and features and signal words might help them when they're reading, give them clues about meaning and structure, or it actually might hinder the student's comprehension. So both aspects of that. So with those things planned and done, now you're ready to read. And like I said, next week, what we will be focusing on is, now that you've set up the reading task, how do you take students through the reading, maybe multiple readings, most likely 1, 2, 3 different readings for different purposes to make the most of that piece of text that you've gone through all the steps of planning for. So next week we'll be doing during reading, and after that we'll be doing the after reading. And I want to thank you all for tuning in today and look forward to being with you next week. Are there any questions? You can type them into the question section, the Q&A. And it was really nice to have everybody log in today. And if you would like to look us up, you can find CRLP Fresno State both on Facebook at CRLP Fresno State or on the web at crlpfresnostate.org. And I see one question here. There will be a copy of this webinar made available probably within the week. And that was one question. And the second question I see here is, how long should the pre-reading time be usually? And I will say that varies a lot. It depends on what type of reading it is. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 minutes, and sometimes it could be 30 minutes or more. Like my example that I gave of the volcanoes, we took 2 days to brainstorm what we already knew, organize our ideas. So I would say probably we spent an hour doing pre-reading work before we actually got to reading the more complex text that they had been assigned. So it really varies. Other times it's just, maybe you only have a couple of students for which that would be new, and you might just have a short lesson with a couple of students. So it really varies a lot. I'm sorry, it's not an easier answer. Depends on the text, depends on the students, and it depends on the task. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you here next week.